welcome to our online history class. So today we are going to be trying to do two things. So the first thing is to understand significant federal laws that were passed in response to civil rights activism. We're going to be looking at four laws just in four slides, so it's going to be a little bit of a quick lecture. And then the second part of what you're going to be doing is demonstrating a basic understanding of the process of making change in the United States. So we've been talking about that over the course of multiple lectures. And today you're going to try to demonstrate that you're understanding what each different factor contributes to the process. So we're going to start with the laws. For this, you should have in front of you the chart that was attached to the assignment on Google Classroom. So you can either print it or you can have this open in one window and then type in it on Google Classroom. Either way, if you want to print and handwrite and then send in a picture, that's also fine. I did want to note that as you're filling out the chart for the laws, you need to do that in your own words. So what you're going to do in the chart is you're going to sum up what did the law do and how did it help make a change. What you're not going to do is just copy what I wrote on the screen, because that's not a very meaningful exercise. So when I'm talking about the law, I'll throw some words up on the screen to help explain it, and then I'll explain some other things in addition, including the limitations of the law. You're welcome to include those in the chart if you like. The way that I would recommend doing this is to listen to each slide and then at the end summarize all of what we talked about into the chart. And you can pause the Edpuzzle at any point if you need time to write or type. Okay, so here we go. We're going to do the first law, which is actually an amendment. So the 24th Amendment is ratified in 1962. Note, this is under Kennedy's presidency. And what the 24th Amendment does is it prohibits the poll tax in federal elections. So I want to throw back to, remember, way back post-Civil War Reconstruction. Remember we talked about how there were three amendments passed, 13, 14, 15. 13th freed the slaves, 14th granted them citizenship, and 15th granted them voting for like 12 minutes, until Reconstruction was over. And then remember, when Reconstruction ended, the southern states tried to reinstitute a whole bunch of measures to prevent people from voting. Anybody remember what some of those were? Like the poll tax is one of them. Okay, but also grandfather clauses and literacy tests, right? And the impact of that is, just kidding, you're actually not exercising that right to vote. So even though the 15th Amendment is passed right after the Civil War, we're almost 100 years later, and Black citizens are still not voting in very large numbers in the South. So this amendment prohibits the poll tax. That's one of the methods that was being used. And if you remember from when we studied Reconstruction, you remember what the poll tax is? That's right, you had to pay to vote. So they're saying you no longer have to do that. And this is really going to help poor people be able to participate in elections, right? Because they're the ones who can't pay to vote. That includes poor white people, but it is primarily going to benefit poor African Americans who have been prevented from voting. Anything else I want to mention about this? Oh, yes, the limitation. Okay, so notice this is federal elections, so it doesn't include state, right? State elections could still include a poll tax, but anytime you're voting for president, for senator, any of your congressmen, you do not have to pay to vote. So that's going to make it easier to vote for both poor whites and poor Black people in the South. Okay, second law that's passed is called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And notice this is under LBJ Johnson. So we're past the point where Kennedy is assassinated. Johnson comes in. In fact, Kennedy wanted to pass a Civil Rights Act, but he just wasn't very good at negotiating with Congress. And Johnson had previously been the Speaker of the House. So he knew how to grease the wheels through Congress, right? So he's able to make this law go through. I remember this is also in response to the Birmingham March, right, where people brought attention to the police fire hoses and everything. And then you had the March on Washington, where 250,000 people showed up in DC like, hey, federal government, want to do something? Okay, the response is passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it's going to do two major things. So the first thing is it ends discrimination in all public accommodations. Okay, now notice at this point, the Supreme Court had tried to desegregate two areas. Anybody remember what the two court cases have desegregated so far? Right, so far we have desegregated schools through Brown versus Board of Education and buses through Browder versus Gale, which is the case that came about after the Rosa Parks incident. Okay, so those two places have been desegregated, but that's it. Remember, the court is very like the scope is usually very contained. They're focusing on one issue at a time. And so what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does is it's like, okay, we're not going to have a court case again for hospitals and like all the other things, parks, right? No, just this law, no more Jim Crow laws, right? You cannot have that. Okay, so that's the first thing that happens as a result of this law. The second thing is it's going to outlaw discrimination in employment based on race, gender, or religion. Okay, so this is basically saying if you are a business, you cannot choose not to hire someone because of their race. Okay, now I need you to think about which of these two things is easier to enforce. You think it's easier to enforce no more Jim Crow and ending segregation, or easier to enforce that businesses can't discriminate? I'll give you a second to think. Okay, so if you said ending discrimination is easier, you are correct. I'm sorry, ending discrimination in public accommodations, like ending segregation. Because if somebody has a colored sign, like you can see on the bottom left on their restaurant, they are clearly breaking the law, and you can fine them or enforce that in some way, right? And you can tell states, nope, you can't have these laws on your books anymore. And if you have one, we know you're breaking the federal law. Okay, when you're hiring someone, though, it's really hard to tell why you chose not to hire someone, right? So I could just be like, oh, that person's not as qualified or whatever. So that second part is going to be a lot more difficult to enforce. And that is what's going to lead to a policy that we now know as affirmative action, which is a really complex policy that attempts to make sure that businesses are not discriminating. It's actually still, at this point, somewhat controversial. And we may get into that at another point in the unit. But these are the two things that are done by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The most significant is ending Jim Crow laws, right? We're saying that's not allowed anymore. Okay, so that's our second law. Here you have a couple of pictures. So up on the top left, you can see that's Martin Luther King Jr. talking to Johnson as they were negotiating the Civil Rights Act of 64. And then down here on the bottom right, you can see there's a picture of Johnson actually signing the bill into law. Also, I did want to mention that if you are interested in this particular law, there's a film that came out just a couple years ago called Selma that deals with marches related to the passage of these sorts of laws. So you could totally check that out. Okay, Voting Rights Act of 1965 is the third law, and this is actually a result of the Selma March. So if you're interested in voting rights in particular, that would be a cool film for you to check out. So the background on the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is that we're going to operate on a new assumption. And that assumption is that if the state has a low Black voter percentage, it is actively interfering with voting. That is not an assumption that the federal government has really operated on previously. They had kind of like looked the other way and been like, whatever, states can do what they want. And with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they're saying, nope, we're not going to do that anymore. So you remember the 24th Amendment got rid of the poll taxes, but we still had some other ones left, right? Anybody remember the other ways that we're keeping Black people from voting in the South, right? Grandfather clauses, literacy tests. Okay, so this law is going to outlaw literacy tests. They're like, no more. You can't do that anymore. And probably the most important part of this law is that it includes an option for federal enforcement. So basically, what they did is they had a formula to figure out what percentage of Black voters were actually voting in your state. And I mean, if you're looking at these deep South states, a lot of them had less than 10% of their Black population actually voting. And so what they said was, look, if less than 10% of your Black population is voting, you are actively preventing them from voting. And if you don't fix it, we're going to send federal officers and they're going to go down there and register your Black voters. And so this law really has teeth for enforcement, right? They're like, we can go and fix this. So that's going to make a huge difference in the actual number of Black voters, especially in these deep Southern states. Okay, last law that we want to look at is called the Immigration Act of 1965. And this is not technically a civil rights law, but it impacts the civil rights movement, and it kind of fits into the time period. So I'm still going to mention it in this context. So the background to this law is actually way back in 1924. If you remember when we studied the 20s, we talked about a law called the National Origins Act of 1924. And per that law, immigration was based off of 2% of a country's population in the 1890 census. Okay, so this is like if we're looking at how many people should come in from, I don't know, Mexico, pick a country. And in 1890, Mexico had 100 people in the United States. Then how many did they get? 2, right? That's how it works. If your country had 0, you get 0, right? So like say South Africa had never sent anyone, they're never going to get to send anyone, right? And we call this a nation-based quota. So the impact of that law was to really cut off immigration, especially from new countries. So what we're going to do in the Immigration Act of 1965 is we're going to repeal those nation-based quotas. So no longer is your immigration based on your population count in 1890. We're just going to have a flat number that can come from each country. And what that means is if you're a new country, you can still come, right? And so if you look at this, oh, shoot. Okay, let's look at the chart really quick, then we'll come back up. So look at the chart at the bottom. And you can see in 1920s, it just drops off, right? Immigration is not happening because of these laws. In 1965, what happens is there is a new wave of immigrants that come in from new countries. So you're going to have a huge wave both from Asia and from Latin America, right? And all these people are going to come in because no longer are they legally, oh, that's terrible. No longer not legally allowed. Okay, but they're legally allowed to come now, right? Because of this new law. So that is going to change the face of the nation significantly. We're going to have way more Asians, way more Latin Americans. They're also going to bring their religions with them. So the population of Catholics in the United States increases. And having all of these new minority groups is going to lend more support to the movements for those groups, right? So like when Cesar Chavez starts his movement, the more Latin Americans you have coming in, the more people there are to support him, right? So that's how immigration really affects the civil rights movement. Okay, so now that we're done looking at the laws, you should have your law chart filled out. Summing up, we want to look at the process of achieving civil rights changes, because that's really what we're mainly aiming at for you to understand. I'm not interested that you like perfectly know all the facts about every single event, but that you do understand like how does this process work in America? Because at some point you may want to be involved in making change, and at minimum, you're going to see this stuff going on in the news. So it's kind of helpful for you to understand what's going on as it's occurring. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at multiple factors that we've talked about. And for each factor, you're going to write 1 to 3 complete sentences to explain how that factor contributes to civil rights change. And then you're going to support your explanation with an example. So I'm actually going to do one of these with you guys so you can get an idea of what I'm asking for. I did want to know, if you can't remember this stuff because you just don't have a great memory and we don't have notes, you can always review the second ed puzzle we did on the process of civil rights and events from Eisenhower's term. That would really help. There's also a review of this at the beginning of the third ed puzzle too, but the second one is most targeted to it. Okay, so and then I did want to also note that on your chart, there's a list of major events we have discussed so far that you could use as your examples. Okay, so let's look at the first factor. For the first factor, you're doing the Supreme Court. And in the first column, you're going to explain what role the Supreme Court plays in the process of civil rights changes. Okay, so can we think about this for a second? Like, what role was the Supreme Court playing in causing the changes to occur? Okay, so what we talked about in the lecture was that the Supreme Court rulings create a foundation for the change, right? So they say, yes, this right should belong to you in this specific context. Okay, and then in the second column, you're supporting your explanation with an example. Okay, so can anybody think of a court case that we talked about that would say that? You can look at the examples if you want. Okay, so like Brown versus Board of Education, right? Establish the right to an integrated education. And then you could also use Browder versus Gale, right, which established the right to integrated buses. Okay, so let's look at what this actually looks like in my chart. So under the Supreme Court for the first one, I wrote the Supreme Court creates the foundation for civil rights changes through rulings. However, the court is not empowered to enforce those rulings directly, right? And we talked about how sometimes states are very slow to respond to those changes. Okay, so this is note 2 sentences. You can do between 1 and 3 to explain your each of the factors. Okay, and then over on the explanation of an example, I have, in this case, Brown versus Board of Education created a precedent for desegregation when the court ruled that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. However, it took schools a while to actually integrate, right? So that's my explanation of like, how does this work and what did it look like in the specific context that we're doing? Okay, so now your next one that you're going to continue on to is the boycott, right? Activist boycotting. So in that first box, you're just going to write in 1 to 3 sentences, how does a boycott work? Like, how does it contribute to change? And then in that second box, you're going to put, okay, what is a boycott that we talked about? Hint, hint, there's only one on the list. And then you're going to explain, like, how is that boycott meant to operate, right? So that's what you're doing. You're just going to finish off the rest of the factors, and then you're going to submit that assignment to Google Classroom. So if you're typing, you can just submit it online, or if you're handwriting, that's fine. You can take a picture of it and submit it that way. Thanks for all your hard work this unit, guys. We're moving into our last week of civil rights next week. Woohoo! So thanks for hanging with us. Stay safe. Love you guys. Bye.